In this video, I'll cover the topic of kerning. Typography is so important as a graphic designer. So if you, for example, are getting your certificate at the college and typography is not a requirement, I highly suggest that you take the time to take a typography class and really delve into a full semester of studying typography. It'll make the difference between you being a good and a great graphic designer. So one of the many important topics of typography is kerning, and that's exactly what's wrong with this word. Whether you noticed it at first glance, hopefully now that you start to really analyze this word, you feel like these two letters kind of feel like they're coming together, maybe these two, but there definitely feels like a separation in the middle, a separation. So it's just lacking a cohesiveness that makes it a word that you really want to look at from an aesthetic point of view. So kerning is adjusting the space between a pair of letters, just exactly what you're seeing here. Right now, the focus on the kerning is between the K and the E. So this word looks like a computer tried to align it. And the good news for us as designers is that the computer can't do everything. We have to use our visual skills for balancing things, for finding out what is just the right amount of kerning. This is an example of how not to kern. You don't literally measure the distance between each letter. If that could be done, then the computer would be great at it. So how do you figure out how to kern a word? Well, there's a couple different analogies and explanations out there. One is to think of pouring water between the letter forms, which is kind of good if you just take that as a rough suggestion and don't get too nitpicky about it, but it still kind of fails to explain things like this. So what I like to do is think of it more like putting a sponge between the letters. And it usually helps to find your like mothership set of letters, which is usually ones that are real obvious. There's no like deviation in the space like there is here. And you say, okay, I like the way that looks. That'll be my sponge. Then I take the sponge over here and I basically squish the sponge or get the same kind of feel for the sponge that's over here. I don't worry about, what it looks like way over here. I'm just kind of getting that feel. So when there's a curved form that curves away, then obviously you have to come in closer to squish the sponge a bit because you basically have a tangent here where there's just like one part of this letter touches that void or that space in between, where here all of it touches it. And here you have the ultimate where there's just a dot here, like one pixel here, one pixel here that comes together. So you really have to squeeze the sponge. This and this are kind of mirror images of each other. And then you have areas that are beyond explanation. So you just have to kind of get your practice in over here and then learn what makes these the best. And especially with a capital letter being the first letter of the word or all caps, you get more of these situations that are just really truly from feel. My favorite way to teach people to kern is to actually cut out letter forms. For one, you get the appreciation for the letter forms when you have to cut them out. And then put them on a table, kern the word as good as you think you possibly can, then have another student come in and nitpick it and make some changes to it. And that kind of obsessive almost behavior in kerning is where you really start to learn it, to feel it. And there's something still odd about the computer. There's a disconnect there where you can spend an hour kerning a word on the computer, print it out, put it up on the wall, and say, I could have done better. So if it's a print-based project, you definitely want to print it and do exactly that. Now, having said that, there are some great methods for learning on a computer. In fact, I won't even copy this. I'll just show you how easy it is to find this. It's a very popular site. Just simply in the search engine, type in Kerning website, and it's probably going to be the first hit that you get. And why this has become so popular is it's one of the ways where you don't actually have to cut out letters, and you get to uh, adjust. Typically, the first and the last letter are locked in place, and then your job is to move around the center ones until you feel like you have a good spacing between them. And once you feel like you have taken that principle of, say, for example, the sponge into account, then you go ahead and you click done and see what the computer scores you, and then you can see what the person who put together the program thinks that the perfect solution was. So I guess I was close enough to what they thought, within probably a pixel, but you can see the blue, they were suggesting moving the O over just a tiny bit more and the L over just a tiny bit more. Now, there is something to be said about that, where if a word is not kerned correctly or poorly kerned, and you have 10 excellent designers, all 10 of them will be like, ugh. Now, if you took all 10 designers and you asked them to kern a word, they might all kern it just a little different. So that's not what we're talking about, is slight differences. We're talking about the obvious things that stick out that will embarrass you if you forget to kern. So that brings us to the next topic, is when do you kern? Well, here's the good news, is when a well-designed font is created, the creator or creating team makes up a list of font pairs. So in other words, when you type two O's next to each other, the designer says those letters need to be closer together than it would when you have a capital H next to a capital L, just like you saw in the previous examples. So you might think, oh, well, good, then I never need to kern. But no. So let's just take an example of, you have a book that you're laying out with 3,000 words of copy in it. Now, you're not going to go through every word of copy in the book and check every single kerning pair that comes up. That's just not practical. And with a good font and good kerning pairs, the computer takes care of that within a margin of error that you can pretty much ignore. So when you really need to kern is when there's focus on it. So typically when it becomes big, so when you have a chapter divider, you're saying this is chapter 7, the whole word chapter and the distance between chapter and the number 7, you would kern that, make it look good. Even in the body copy, you're reading along, and then you come to what's known as a subhead. It's not quite the headline like a chapter divider or the title of the chapter, but it's a breakup to let you know a new topic is coming. So yes, you would kern the subheads because it's bigger, it has more focus on it. Everything on the cover of the book you would kern. And you think even a business card, well, that's tiny, that you're not going to worry about that. No, the business card is important. That is whoever you're designing the business card for, that's their, first thing people see sometimes. So you want to make sure their name is perfect on it. And one of the worst offenders of kerning is numbers. So whenever you use numbers, you've got to go in and look at the spacing between the numbers. Hopefully you see that right away now, because we've been talking about it. So why are numbers offenders? Well, you have to imagine if these numbers were lined up in columns, you want the columns to stay perfect. So the kerning pairs between numbers are set up to give them equal spacing, not to make them look good. So when you need them to look good on anything that you design, you have to remember that a 1 takes up the same amount of space as, like an 8 or a 9 or a 7. So then the next question is, how do you kern? So I'm on Essentials. With Essentials reset, I'm going to take the type tool, just the regular type tool. I'm going to place it in between the worst offender that comes up first, And notice I just have a blinking cursor between the two. You do not make a selection like that. You just simply put the cursor between. You go over to the properties panel and you look for the thing that looks like the selection we just made, and that is kerning. And what I like to do is just place my cursor in here like a swipe across so everything's highlighted, and then that way I can just use the down arrow key and look at the word or the number in this case, and as I'm putting in those negative numbers here, I can keep my eye on it and say, okay, I think that's okay, maybe I went just a little too far. Then I come over, put my cursor between the next one, do the same thing, swipe my cursor in here, go negative numbers until I start to get something that I can be happy with. Sometimes you'll feel like you're never done with kerning. You'll print it out, you'll realize I need to change it a little bit, you'll go back in here, you'll make some changes. So that is a very good advertisement for never outlining your text. Now, what about when you do have to outline your text? Well, what you do is you outline a copy of it. So I'm going to leave that not outlined. I'm going to make a copy over here. And then this one I would feel okay about outlining, because when I print it out and I realize, oop, I should have put maybe a little less space between the 9 and the 7, I can come back and I can do that. Exactly. Put the cursor between here. Once it's outlined, by selecting and doing type create outlines, now even if I ungroup them, I can't put the cursor in between them. I can't change the numbers. So outlining is only good for certain things. So always, always keep a copy of the non-outlined. And what talk about kerning would not be complete without talking about the thing that is often confused for kerning. So kerning, again, think pairs of letters. Right now I would be adjusting the pair of characters here, the 9 and the 7, here the 1 and the 0. When you make a selection, then generally you're trying to change the spacing of everything, and that is what's known as tracking. And just kind of keep this in mind. One, you track very little as a designer because the creator of the font set the distance between the characters up a certain way for aesthetic reasons. So you very rarely have to go in and manipulate that. And if you ever make the selection here like that, you realize, oh, that is for tracking. This is the one you want, just a click in between. Kerning, paraletters, tracking, uniformly adjusting all of the text that you have selected. So if this whole area was selected, this is exactly what it looks like. When you reduce the tracking, everything becomes super, super tight. And then when you increase it, everything becomes very loose. Here's a couple more notes about when it might be permissible to track. And then back to kerning. Just practice as much as you possibly can. Like I said, this website is not a bad place to start, and there's plenty of words in here that await you.